Okay. Okay. So, well, welcome again, everybody, wherever you are, to this next 6858 virtual lecture. We have two guests with us today, Jessica Murray and Mark Silas. Mark Silas is the VP, Vice President for IS&T. And there's going to be hopefully a good opportunity to sort of hear about security in practice at MIT and what it takes and what kind of things IS&T is running into. So it's going to mostly be interactive. I don't know, Mark, you want to say a couple of few words, and Jessica, maybe a few words just to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Mark Silas. I'm the head of IS&T. When times are good and when they're not, I'm probably hiding behind people like Jessica. No, it's great to be here with you guys, and hope you and all your families are staying safe and sound. Tough time like this. And so we'll talk a little bit about anything you're interested in. I think we'll try and answer every question as honestly and straightforwardly as we can. Definitely appreciate the opportunity to speak with folks. And Jessica, I think you have yourself and a couple of your team members as well that you could introduce.
Yep. Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm the Information Security Officer in IS&T, and I've invited Paul Renaud and Ryan Cook from my team. That's basically just the three of us on the security team at IS&T. So looking forward to hearing your questions, and hope everybody is staying safe.
Okay, Mark, and maybe Jessica too, could you maybe tell us, like in one or two sentences, like how you got into security and how did you got into sort of administration of security computer systems?
Sure. So I was an MIT student a long time ago and many pounds ago, in the mid 90s. And I started out, doing Core 6. And at the time, there was no network security team. So there was no net security. Information security was kind of a new era, undefined thing. So our first security efforts at MIT were really set up to have primarily just an incident reporting system so people could report security issues. So it was actually set up in about 1997, and it was an entirely volunteer-led organization. So it was staffed primarily by students. So I was also we used to have this thing called ResNet coordinators, which probably sounds silly now, but many years ago, within each dormitory, there was somebody designated to help people get connected to the internet, issue them IP addresses and Ethernet cables pre-Wi-Fi. But we also served in a lot of the capacity of trying to provide good security information and practices to people, both in the residential facilities. It was very early days, so I think the types of threats that were out there were NIMDA, Code Red, things that I don't know, maybe Franz can say they may be in the teaching materials now. No one's probably heard of them at this point, but they were early internet type worms that, infected for thousands of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of devices kind of across the internet. MIT's at that point was probably the first time we really had our eyes open. Now, to be fair, most of our sophisticated folks weren't running Windows, so they were never impacted by any of this. But for folks who are running Windows systems, the mid to late 90s started to kind of open eyes about kinds of vulnerabilities and things people were dealing with. Our situation is probably a little bit more complicated compared to some institutions because we run a fairly open environment. We always strive to run an open environment, and it goes back to Jerry Salzer's end-to-end principles that were, some of you are hopefully read about in classes like 6033. But MIT really has stayed true to a lot of those values, and that means makes security a little bit harder. Also, I think it makes our clientele and the people who operate on the campus a little bit more sophisticated. But for a lot of these applications at the time, these operating systems, there weren't a lot of options to secure them. So we were in a tough situation, and it's come a long way since then. Obviously, we spend millions of dollars on security a year. We have a variety of tools and capabilities that Jessica and her team operate. And it continues to become, honestly, it's probably one of the most challenging parts of the job. I think it's really the kinds of things that keep people like myself and the people I work for up at night. And it's an incredible challenge in today's day and age. Threats we were worried about then were relatively simple in terms of, if you had patched, you had a pretty good peace of mind that you were in good shape. If you kept your security up to date or your software and configurations, well maintained. But today, we're facing all sorts of threat vectors for bugs that we don't even know about yet, 0-day bugs, other kinds of vulnerabilities. And now, we've made a big shift to cloud. And so, cloud has allowed us to do things like this with Zoom, which is fantastic. It's something we could not stand up on campus in any linear part of time. But I think at the same time, it's kind of changed the security paradigm a little bit, where we don't have the same level of insight or transparency in terms of how the infrastructure is operated, how these various kinds of systems work. And it's actually probably made the job a little bit harder, as we kind of go forward. But that's just something we'll have to grapple with, as I think the cloud thing is kind of here to stay, because the capabilities it brings just go well beyond anything we could kind of do traditionally on campus.
Maybe I'll start with one question. First of all, thank you guys. Actually, you made time during, I know this is a pretty busy time at IS&T. And so maybe you could sort of summarize a little bit, like how does the whole incident, the whole COVID-19 has changed, your life in the last 6-7 weeks.
Sure.
And what do you see change in the type of attacks, or like what's going on?
So I'd say for us, the last I guess it's been months now, 6 to 8 weeks, feels like 7 to 10 years in terms of just what we've been through. I've been here at MIT some time, both as a student and as a staff member. I don't think I've seen so much change in such a small period of time, throughout that duration. I think it kind of started with just a lot of consideration in early March about what we would do if any of these situations came to pass with respect to, social distancing, really de-densifying the campus, those kinds of things. I'll be honest, like when we started that discussion, probably with Ian Waits, I would say like first or second week of March, it would be hard to imagine we'd be where we are today. I mean, I don't know. It happened very quickly. It really forced us to adopt a bunch of new technologies under a very fast time frame. I'd say normally we'd adopt some of these technologies on the scale of years. I think we ended up doing on the scale of days or weeks. I'll give you an example. We were primarily a WebEx shop for video conferencing. We had to adopt Zoom based on community demand with, 3 days notice. So, that's, I think an interesting problem would be, what's one of our hardest parts of our job is probably managing the bureaucracy of buying something. It's probably one of the hardest things to do at MIT, but everybody really rose to the occasion, and, whether it's finance or our IT staff, really helped bring a bunch of these new capabilities. So things like Zoom, things like Slack, so we could have, asynchronous capabilities to interact with each other through messaging in a, comprehensive fashion. Other kinds of things like huge interest in, for example, expanded use of Dropbox, so people could create video content for their classes and get that stuff online, became a huge thing that they really needed. So we went from having, 100 gigabyte quotas to like terabyte quotas for people, just so they could manage these video assets. Even folks at Lincoln Lab, which have very different security requirements than we do, for example, just decided they had to move to Zoom with like 2 days notice. And I'm not talking about like security restricted Zoom, but they moved to the public Zoom that we're on, just because they had to continue operations, which is something, for example, Lincoln would just never entertain under even normal circumstances. Canvas, we had a bunch of school, one of the challenges we had is, I think you guys are all on Katsu probably, but a large part of the campus still using legacy learning management system. Had to get a big rush to get a newer learning management system and capabilities to support things like online grading with some cloud-based products called Gradescope. There's even an online test proctoring system that we're looking to use for the advanced standing exams, and we were debating whether to use for finals or not this spring. Decided not to use it for finals, but we're going to use it for the advanced standing exams in the fall. And just all sorts of new capabilities that we had to add. I'd say normally we would have gone through a lot of review and discussion and assessment of the risks and the security impacts and all sorts of different things. As Jessica can tell you, we just didn't have time to do that. So it's really kind of presented us with taking on a lot more risk than we normally would with a lot less information. And as you've seen from some of the articles about things like Zoom and other things, there's been some security challenges with some of those products. And we've worked through those, and hopefully people haven't been victims of things like Zoom bombing at MIT, at least knock on wood as of yet. But, you know, it's been a very dynamic landscape, and it's really forced us to adjust on the fly, you know, much more quickly than we normally would. So we try to embrace, you know, the MIT problem-solving spirit the best we can, but we've taken on probably a significant amount of change, and with change comes risk than we would under any normal circumstance. And the repercussions of that we're probably still dealing with to this day.
Jessica, can you say maybe one or two things about, like, you know, is there has been a change in the sort of the type of incidents that you're seeing in the last 6-7 weeks?
We're definitely seeing COVID-19 related phishing that's been pretty effective, unfortunately, in stealing credentials, compromising accounts. Other than that, I think we've probably seen a lot of the same threats that we would on campus. One thing with everybody moving so quickly to working at home, we've got a lot of people who are working on their personal devices. And, you know, there wasn't a lot of planning or you know, maybe setting this up in a more organized fashion that would have happened. You know, they're not all having their own MIT laptops and such at home. So there's definitely, like as Mark said, risk that we've been taking on in that fashion.
Okay, so let me open it up for students to ask questions. Hopefully this gives a little bit of background for everybody to jump in. And I want to encourage all the students that are online, you know, jump in. Mark and Jessica have been always extremely forthcoming in the last couple of years, and that's always been very interesting. There are a couple of questions in the chat list box, so I'll read out one of them. The first one is from Daniel Robert. How has selling some IP4 addresses space to Amazon change security? How many firewalls on campus do you estimate accepted from 18, you know, star?
You know, I think it's certainly, you know, it's had a variety of complexities. You know, in terms of address space and firewall ACLs, you know, I think within IS&T, just as a data point, we probably changed tens of thousands of IP ACO rules to kind of adjust for that. I think one of the other ones beyond just security is licensing. Something I'll just point out that, you know, still blows my mind, but a large part and the majority of the library's licensing model. So if you use any of the library's journals or any of the other variety of things that they subscribe to for MIT, a lot of that is still done by default through IP-based restrictions. So one of the more difficult things we had to do is with each journal, with each publication, was work with the libraries to update every single one of those contractually, and that took a significant amount of time. And that was certainly much more difficult. We did a lot of outreach to groups across campus to kind of let them know about this as this was happening. And, you know, we've worked through the IT partners and some other groups, but I'm sure there's still some that, you know, have not adopted. Some of the things we've done is, one of the nice things is if you get an Amazon VM in US East or other areas, you can now get MIT IP addresses if you select Elastic IPs. So like myself, all my Amazon VMs now have former MIT IP addresses, just for the nostalgia in me. I couldn't just let go of that. So, so we have those, and we've been using those within IS&T to test and port scan things where we can, to try and get an assessment of are there things we just missed or other people may have missed. So we've tried to use those things as tools to hopefully better understand any risks or things that are still outlying.
There's another question from Kritamata, and I think it's for Jessica. Can you talk about the phishing email that has been just like the burst out of nowhere in all the mailing list before this? How does it happen?
Oh, how does it happen? I think you're probably talking about the phishing email. It's been really common lately, where the subject is something like incoming mail delayed, or you have a voicemail or something like that. Unfortunately, often that starts with a compromised MIT account. That's where they're coming from. Obviously, that account was compromised somehow, so maybe they got a phishing email from outside, and then their account was compromised, and then it kind of chains through. And we've been seeing variations of that since, I think, January. Am I right, guys? And usually in a typical quarter, we keep metrics on how many accounts are compromised, and you know, usually we would see maybe like 10 or something over the course of 3 months. But so far with that specific campaign, it's very convincing to people. There's been like, I think over 100 accounts compromised just in the past few months. What the attack looks like is that, there's just a link to click to see, your delayed email or whatever. And it, brings you to a fake Outlook web access login page. If you enter your password, it captures that information, and then it just redirects you to the real Outlook web access page. So if you're already logged in, you'll just go there. If you are not, it'll just show a login page, and you'll probably just assume that you mistyped your password. So it's very effective and low risk for the attacker to do that, unfortunately. And there's not a lot of, we do respond to those when they're reported to us. So if you've ever used phishing at mit.edu, please do that. Paul and Ryan are very quick on those when we see them, and suspend any compromised accounts, report the malicious fake login pages to the provider so they can take them down, and things like that. We also are, well, I think it's kind of done. We're working on automating the process of notifying the people who received the phishing message so that they're aware and warned that that wasn't real. So we're hoping that that'll help also spread the word. Oh, sorry, Franz, you're on mute.
I'm going to ask, we read about or learned about all kinds of technologies in the class, and I guess one thing is two-factor authentication. Would that help more, or
That would help more.
So
yeah,
so why is that not happening?
I think the short answer is it doesn't work well with our current mail system environment with Exchange on-prem and the way we have it set up. But the goal in the, I think, relatively shortish term is to move everybody to O365 email, and then we could put on two-factor authentication. Fortunately, we do have 2FA on most other things on campus, so the value of those compromised credentials, really all they can do is just log in to your email and send more spam. It's good that we have it on Atlas and other things so that they can't, mess with your direct deposit and such.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think doing two-factor authentication take a use case like a SMTP mailer like SendMail or XM or anything of your choice, which a lot of the abuse we've seen comes through. There's not a good UI for that, whether it's no way to pop up a dialog box or do the things we do with web-based applications. And I think that's also a challenge with some of the legacy mail applications that use protocols like IMAP. It's very hard to kind of provide a simplified, strong user experience with 2FA with that.
Let me encourage the students to ask questions. You can also either through the chat or just ask them out loud. Either one is fine.
Zoom security. What do we do on the security side when MIT implements third-party services like Zoom? Do we evaluate the service and notify people of its weaknesses, or are there things we do to try and increase it? So I think we definitely try to evaluate those things up front. I think under normal circumstances, it's something we would have a variety of people taking a look at kind of ahead of time, including our security folks and our technical teams to kind of get an assessment of, and also just to look at the landscape and see what the risk is. A lot of the cloud security in terms of information that's available about the vendors is done through basically a self-auditing process where they produce these reports on an annual or biannual basis that you can review. I don't think it's one of the challenges I think with a lot of these providers right now is there's no real strong regulatory components, and I'm not one to ever argue for regulation or record things of that nature, but a lot of the things they're doing in the security area is self-reporting. So they'll try to self-audit, self-reported things of that nature, or they'll hire firms but the standards kind of vary between. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think one of the other challenging things is, ultimately with these types of products, just the use cases are very hard to imagine and anticipate sometimes. Something like Zoom, for example, definitely configuration of these products is something that can impact security. By default, and you can read this in the various articles, Zoom came with a lot of very insecure by default options enabled. So as an example, by default, anyone joining a Zoom meeting could share their screen. That was a Zoom-wide default. So, one of the things MIT did when we implemented it is, we decided, do we want to keep that on or not? Actually, people did decide to keep it on because it makes the user experience a lot better. One of the things we did decide to do, though, as an example, was we decided to raise the bar, or at least provide the option, so that people could require that people participating in their Zoom sessions would be authenticated. So some of the biggest vulnerabilities with Zoom come from the fact that if anyone got their hands on the link or the invite that contains the email, the password, then they could just join your meeting in Zoom bomb. That's one of the big risks. So one of the things we did was we created an option so people could require authentication. But one of the trade-offs we decided was we weren't going to necessarily take away some of those convenience features based on discussion with faculty and with staff that they felt was important to preserving an easy experience. So we decided to give the option to secure the meeting better so you know who the attendees are. But if people, in terms of conduct, aren't necessarily conducting themselves in the right way, then that would be managed through normal MIT channels, the Committee on Discipline or other kinds of HR mechanisms, if anything like that were to happen, which is the same as what it would be today in the classroom. So we decided to do that. And I would say if you look at Zoom and any of the information out there, their security has been evolving fairly rapidly over the last month. They decided to change things where, they don't want people by default to be able to share screens. They don't want people by default to be able to do the whiteboard, which allows you to mark up somebody else's screen if they're sharing. So there's a variety of things that have been evolving. One of the big ones that was interesting to us, just is to show you the different sides of MIT from a security standpoint, at least in terms of how we think about things, Zoom recordings. So we encourage and strongly encourage people to use the recording feature of Zoom if they're doing synchronous content. In particular for people who may be time zone challenged, or they may have infrastructure challenges that don't allow them to participate live in the session synchronously. And so we strongly encourage people to capture those through Zoom recordings. One of the things we didn't anticipate actually was, if you've been to most MIT classes, we don't check people in when they come in the classroom, and it's pretty wide open. Our colleagues at Sloan actually operated a very different business model where they didn't want Zoom recordings to be available. Sloan has a very different model security-wise, where they consider the actual security of the class itself and any content said in the class is very, very critical to them, because they invite a variety of speakers, CEOs, business executives, sharing information and stories about, as part of their case studies, internal things they would never want to get out as part of the class. And so for Sloan's use case, the security of the Zoom recordings became a huge issue. So we changed the default security for the Zoom recordings, so you need to be authenticated to download them. But even for Sloan, that wasn't sufficient, because they want actual authorization, not just authentication, to ensure that they're a member of someone in the Sloan community who should have access to that. So that's not something we've actually fixed, but those are the kinds of things we've been grappling with Zoom. And I think the other thing is just trying to educate the user community about good practices. And I think any technology, if you don't do the right thing, you can always get yourself into trouble. And we've done a lot of work to try and make sure that we put information out there about how to conduct a secure meeting. Some of the more sensitive meetings MIT has take for something like tenure, which is probably one of the most sensitive type meetings MIT ever has. And there's things said in those discussions which are fairly confidential and sensitive. So they're like, hey, how do we conduct a secure meeting? So you can do a variety of things beyond passcodes. You can require everyone to be personally admitted. You can disable the ability to call in. So those are the kinds of things we've been working through. But beyond the technical, it's probably been a big part of it's been education for us with Zoom. Jessica, you probably talk a little bit about the things you guys look at in some of the reports and other things you guys deal with on a fairly biannual basis.
Sure. One of the things that we usually get from vendors is an audit report called the Sauk report, where there's a few different kinds of similar things, and it'll tell you basically it's prepared by a third-party auditing company, and so as you can imagine, it's really dry and boring to read, and they can be quite long and repetitive, but it'll tell you how good the vendor is doing in regard to some standard, and that's usually like ISO 27001 or something like that. So we don't usually get to review the vendor's security policy and all of that directly, but we have access to these audit reports that do. There's also a tool developed by EDUCAUSE called the HECFAT, the Higher Education Cloud Vendor Assessment Tool, I think, and it's just a spreadsheet, but it asks a lot of questions that are really great at kind of getting to the core at what the vendors are doing and whether, what kind of data might be acceptable to place or be used in that service. But it's kind of a snapshot in time, and it's only as good as the answers we get. So there's always that kind of risk that you're trusting them and that they're keeping up with it. The other, I forgot my train of thought, but we did have one vendor who had like glowing Sauk reports for years, and then they changed auditors and had some findings, is what they call when there's problems, and called them in to have a meeting because this is a vendor managed by one of the central departments, and they were very concerned about this, that things have been going well up until this year, and you just got acquired, what's the deal? And their excuse was basically that they changed auditors and the other auditor was kind of giving them a pass and they didn't realize it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I kind of touched on, Lincoln Lab was using our standard Zoom. One of the areas that has some better regulation around the use of cloud products is the federal requirements around using cloud products. It's usually done under a program which acronym is FedRAMP. So they have much more specific requirements about the actual vendors, about their security requirements and how they deliver their services. So that's a much more regulated example, not something we use generally here on campus. But Lincoln, in this case, for example, moved their Zoom usage from the instance we're using into their own FedRAMP certified instance, which has a very different type of set of requirements and rules around it. But that's an area where it is regulated much more so than it is on the public cloud side today.
Yeah. We also have, whenever we enter into a contract, the lawyers and VPF and OGC, there's clauses that they put in the contract to protect the institute and our data too. So it's not just us looking at this stuff.
Okay, let's see. Question about the spam filter. Generally, emails to a list come in delayed over multiple hours. So what prevents you from stopping the spam flood while it's still in progress? Also, would it be possible to delete the spam directly in the mailbox after it has been delivered? So, so on the last point, I'll take that first. We really don't delete messages once they're in people's inboxes. There's a really strong expectation of privacy at MIT that we feel very strongly about too. And so once things have been delivered to someone's mailbox, we don't modify the contents of people's mailboxes under any kind of normal practice. It's not to say, I guess there could be some crisis where we'd be forced to do so, but that hasn't really happened to this point. So that we don't do that as just a general rule. Any kind of access to people's mailbox under MIT policies and procedures requires the sign off of a senior officer. So it's a fairly significant bar to do those types of things. So we don't generally do that. Emails to the list come in delayed over multiple hours. So it depends where the delays are happening. I think that's one of the big challenges is, we process 3-4 million email messages a day. Some of the delays happen in various parts of the system post-processing, and that makes it difficult to kind of, necessarily make any changes at that point. So, I think we do try and tackle them if we can get them quickly enough. If they're still queued, we will address those kinds of things. But I will say the speed at which email moves through the system, and Jessica's folks can attest to this, is fairly rapid. And usually if it's queuing, it's probably moved beyond our purvey at that point in some cases, but not all. You know, some of the delays, you know, we could talk about that, which is actually an artifact of email security practices, which have been evolving over the years. A lot of running email lists has become a huge challenge on today's internet, mostly because technologies for email security, such as DMARC, DKIM, SPF, make email lists a very, very difficult thing to operate these days, which contributes to the delays, actually, is a big part of it. Jessica, you want anything on spam?
Spam. Yeah, I know that other schools and some organizations, you know, they do go back and delete malicious email from people's inboxes, and that's just something that, like as Mark said, due to privacy reasons, we haven't even really explored. That doesn't mean that there might be tools or features in the future that could maybe help us, but we do see often these compromised accounts. There's a mail quota threshold where, you know, if you send over that in 24 hours, you're kind of cut off from sending mail. And we've seen that some of these attackers, whether they, I don't know, actually it's probably in the KB published what that threshold actually is, but they seem to be lately being more sophisticated about staying just under the radar, which is kind of annoying because then it defeats some of our monitoring and alerting, and it might go unnoticed until someone reports that to us.
Yeah, it is an arms race. For every time we get another security measure in place, they continue to find ways to get around them. You know, it's better than it has been, but it's continual evolution. So it's something we'll always be, I think, grappling with fairly or unfairly until they become non-lucrative. When they don't make any more money getting you spams, then maybe the whole thing will go away. Could you share an interesting attack or non-malicious user activity that you've come across in your career? You want to go first on that one, Jessica, or would you like me to do one?
Oh, I could do one. We had, well, I'll do a non-malicious user activity one that was kind of interesting. We got a call from one of our IT partners folks letting us know that they had found a Bitcoin miner, and we were like, how did you know that it was a Bitcoin miner, and what was the story there? So it turns out that someone had installed this device that actually just literally on the outside said, like, had some brand Bitcoin miner, this little specially designed thing, and they had put it like in above a duct in an office kind of lab area. Probably didn't think that people would notice. You know, they came in and put it over the weekend, and it was so loud that on Monday morning when people started, you know, going into that space, they thought that there was some kind of HVAC problem, and they called facilities. And then they discovered this device had been attached. So that was kind of, I don't know, a little bit more interesting for us because we could like see it and touch it, which usually we don't get to do. We had an interesting attack last year in a lab where the server that everybody would use to SSH in as jumping off from other devices was compromised, and had the SSH library was, you know, borked, and basically it was collecting credentials from everybody who logged in and ingoing and outgoing. So it spread quite widely through that lab, unfortunately. That was interesting because there were multiple actors in that same space at the same time, and we were also getting calls from the FBI letting us know that they were detecting activity in that same area. And I mean, it turned out in the end it was, you know, it was pretty well contained, and it the threat actor, what I really worry about is, an APT stealing intellectual property or PII or something like that. And their motives seem to be much more financial and trying to compromise servers in order to send more spam, unfortunately. But at least they weren't, doing something that would be more destructive to the Institute.
I can offer my favorite, at least to date. Mine was pretty much started, and Jessica was party to this too at the time, so she can feel free to chime in. Mine started when we were prototyping and trying out a product called CrowdStrike. So CrowdStrike, I don't know if those of you have or haven't heard of it. It's basically an agent that runs on your computer or your server and looks for naughty activity. So we were trying it out on, I don't know, probably a handful of servers in the data center at that point. And we, so it was a little POC. We had kind of forgotten about it, to be honest with you. We kind of lost track. I mean, like you guys, I'm sure you're busy and a number of things can come up and, take your attention away. So one day we get a call from these folks at CrowdStrike, and they say that, hey, you guys probably got a problem on your network. You really should take a look at this. And we had actually forgotten we were even running this stuff. We're like, what do you mean we got a problem? So we decided to look into it a little bit further. And lo and behold, we had set up the CrowdStrike software on one of our testing servers in our data center Windows machine. And it actually got a hit from an actual IS&T staff member's account, actually trying to log in to the server and trying to install, I think, what was it, Mimikatz, Jessica?
Yep.
Which is the keystroke logger, so that it could capture passwords. So this really caught us off guard. We're like, well, one, how did this happen? And two, what's going on? Where did this come from? It just to give you a sense of these types of things. So this started an odyssey and a journey, I think, that lasted, the better part of 6 months at that point in time in terms of investigation. It's just amazing how complex these things are. So to take a step back from there, once you dig into the compromised account, you figure out how, that happened, and you start to dig and work your way backward. It's pretty interesting in terms of the sense of, it was folks actually using compromised MIT credentials they had gotten, I think it turns out, through phishing, but they had, never revealed that to the person from which they got the credentials. And it had a very interesting use pattern. So they would use the credentials of about 3 specific accounts, and they would every day at about 8 a.m. in Asia Pacific time, they would log in and to the VPN, and they would start their daily activity. So we started to watch these folks because we hadn't really revealed that we had, turned off the accounts yet because we wanted to see what they were doing. And every day they would log in like clockwork, 8 a.m. Monday through Friday, and they would go scanning the MIT campus network, looking for things and trying to, connect to systems, looking for Windows shares, remote desktop, SSH, and other kinds of things. I think, to me, the thing that became the most interesting is, one, this is done by professionals. This wasn't script kiddies or kids just trying to, Jessica touched on with spammers trying to send, 10,000 emails and get a few hits to a web link. These are people who were actually at this for, honestly, we could only go back 3 or 4 months. It was probably longer than that. And that's just because our logs don't go back any farther, because we try to minimize those things for the name of user privacy. It makes it a bit of a challenge when you're doing these kinds of investigations. Lo and behold, how many machines did we have to seize and image their drives? 30 or something like that? 30,
something
40?
like that. I mean, I think they're still in our office, unfortunately.
Yeah, so the investigative effort just kept expanding and expanding, because every time you would take a step back, you'd find another compromised account, you'd find another compromised device, and then you would go there and dig into that one, and it just expands like an n-squared networking problem. So we went at this for the better part of 6 months, but this is something, honestly, we would have had no idea it was going on. None. I mean, if it wasn't for this CrowdStrike thing, it would have been a long time before we knew this was going on. It turns out this is being done by nation state actors. This isn't something that was done by, any run-of-the-mill kind of group. And they're actually looking for specific targeted areas, right? So one of the things to us that was interesting is one of their big targets was audit. It was MIT's audit department. And when you step away from it, you start to ask yourself, why would they target the audit department? You know, Jessica and I avoid those groups like the plague. And if you ever get into administration, you will too someday. But the audit department has an interesting role at MIT in that they oversee and audit everything. So that including activities that take place in Lincoln Lab and in other places. So it gives anyone who's trying to find out more about what MIT is doing or things that MIT may be up to, and it's a one-stop shop. They have everything on like a one-stop server with everything they're working on, and it makes it a very high-value target. So this is really a dedicated effort. I think that going on for months and months, maybe a year or longer, and it really opened our eyes to the kinds of threats you're kind of grappling with, where normally we're worried about things like spam or phishing or, you know, compromised account or machines. This is just well beyond anything we'd ever seen. And they were using 0-day vulnerabilities, things that weren't public yet in the public domain, even things where we thought we were relatively secure. It wasn't good enough. And it really kind of opened our eyes up to the risks. It certainly opened my eyes and the senior administration's eyes up to the kinds of things that are out there. And you should never feel a sense of security. And I think that was the one big takeaway, is you just can't ever feel secure. Even if you've done everything right, that may still not be enough. And it was really a humbling experience. And it was a wake-up call. We got very lucky. There's other schools and peer institutions that did not. And it had a much more profound impact on them, whether it compromised their entire Active Directory and every password, you know, in their institution. But we were fairly lucky in that respect. Let's see. I run some XVM servers. I notice a lot of weird probing traffic on the web logs from inside the MIT network. Is IS&T actively scanning the network, or should I be worried? Jessica can answer the question about scanning, but you know what? You should always be worried. Because, as Jessica pointed out, internal machines do get compromised. So, you know, be careful with that. But go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, we do some scanning, but outside of IS&T managed environment, it's pretty little. So I would be worried.
Yeah, I would.
Oh, that's the IP? That actually might be ours.
You might be okay after all.
You might be okay.
Still be vigilant.
Yeah.
Other questions, things top of mind for you guys? Franz, you're still on mute, I think.
People next door are monitoring the lawn, and so trying to keep the noise under control. Last week, we had Nick Matheson came by to talk about Tor and read the Tor paper and all that good stuff. And I know, as you know, there's a whole bunch of Tor servers on or Tor nodes on the campus network. So what is the impact for these Tor nodes on IS&T? You know, what does that?
Well, I think for us, you know, so Tor, I think, is actually a great invention. I think it's really helped in a lot of ways. It's been a great tool in countries that don't allow the same freedoms that we enjoy here. And I think that's been a good thing. So we're very supportive of Tor as a technology and for its advancement and development. I think, like anything, it can be used for good and bad. You know, and so unfortunately, probably the bad use cases make it to Jessica's desk. You know, so we get a lot of reports from law enforcement about Tor nodes on campus. And I think, you know, our answer is pretty boilerplate at this point. If it's a Tor node, we tell the folks inquiring it's a Tor node. And there isn't much more we can do about that. And that's generally, in terms of incidents we see, that's pretty much the extent of it at this point. I think the other risk with Tor, and, you know, it's caused some issues with us, it's not necessarily the use of it itself, but sometimes people who want to take action or hacktivism against different Tor nodes because they're being used to do things that they don't like, any site that's running Tor nodes becomes a target. And, you know, they can launch DDoS attacks or other kinds of things just with the intent of disabling the Tor node specifically. But at the same time, if it's running in a dorm room or it's running in a lab, it could impact the entire campus network. And that's happened on several occasions. So, you know, it's resulted in significant disruption. You know, things we can mitigate and we have tools to do, but, you know, they do bring, Tor nodes do bring their own set of risks with them, both by their reputational behavior and just the types of targets that it may make your institution or any kinds of IP addresses that are hosting those services. How about you, Jessica? Still love Tor nodes?
Yeah, they're great. I mean, mainly we get a lot of, like as you say, reports or notices from people who run other networks where they might be getting scanned from one of our Tor nodes or something, or get some sort of malicious traffic. And fortunately, we have some automation in our ticketing queue, so we can kind of squash most of that and just send a really boilerplate message, as Mark said, that just says basically it's a Tor node and we know, sorry, this is what Tor is. One thing that we do when we report metrics up, we have them, the different segments of the network scored by this company that gives us a security score, kind of like a credit score. And they look at a lot of different things, but it's nice that we can separate out the different segments, the administrative versus academic and residential, where maybe the Tor nodes are, so we can show that although the Tor nodes might be diminishing our reputation and malicious traffic looks like it's coming from 18, it's not in these like more secure parts of the network. So, we just find ways to mitigate it.
Thanks. Here's one from Daniel Robert. Do you get more problems with lab managed computers than with ones you manage? So I'd say we're pretty lucky that most folks do a pretty good job of managing their computers within the labs. I'd say one of the bigger challenges we have is some of the equipment, specifically laboratory equipment, microscopes, different testing machines, otherwise, they all come with pretty much an embedded Windows operating system. And I don't know, we still have some out there that are running Windows XP, I think, at this point. Is that still true, Jessica?
Yeah, hopefully they're not actually on the network, but they're definitely out there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges with the lab environment is just a reflection of the dynamics of MIT. Most lab equipment is bought through grant funding, which means it was pretty much done as a one-time project. But a lot of those assets, be they computers or be they other lab equipment, are used much longer time frame. But that means that there may not necessarily be funds to replace it or to renew it. With some of the equipment, with the XP machines, we said to the lab, hey, you should upgrade to this new Windows 10 machine. They said that'd be great, but the grant's expired and I don't have $100,000 to buy a new, control system. So I think the lab has its own dynamics. We try to keep our machines on a fairly standard set and, life cycle about no more than 3 years. But in other environments, the fact that you have varying vintages of equipment, varying vintages of operating systems and configurations can make it a bit of a challenge. How many browsers do you recommend using on a single machine? I don't know, Jessica, how many browsers?
I don't know, as many as you need, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend Chrome, generally speaking, but I think there might be others that people are interested in.
I have 4.
You have 4? Okay, which 4 do you have?
Or wait, no, I actually might have 4. I kind of anyway, I use different browsers for different things. I can't talk today. So basically, I have one browser that I'm using mainly for work-related activities. I have another browser that I use for non-work-related activities. And then I have a couple other unique browsers that I use just because they have interesting features. So for me, I use Chrome for work, Firefox personal. I use what's called Epic, which is basically a Chrome-based variant. And that's interesting because it comes with a built-in VPN. So sometimes if I have to look at something and I want to see something but not be on the MIT network or whatever network I am, I can open that up, use the VPN feature in that so I can look like I'm coming from another country. I can pick and choose pretty much where I'm coming from just to see if I can see the different data. And I also use Safari, probably the least, mainly because I don't have a problem with Safari, but A lot of the plugins I like to use aren't available on Safari. So Safari is kind of like my vanilla browser.
Thank you, man. Ryan, that's great. Another question from Leon. Is there a reason why MIT Wi-Fi occasionally becomes very slow? Uh, Wi-Fi is a challenge. So I'd say on a couple of fronts. One is using unlicensed spectrum. And unlicensed spectrum means you're competing with other devices in the same spectrum. Some may be 802.11 based devices. Some may be other kinds of things like wireless or cordless phones or other kinds of devices. So I think the fact that it's unlicensed spectrum makes it a huge challenge in terms of managing it. So that's one of the things we grapple with. I think some of the other challenges include things like a lot more use of 5 gigahertz technology now for better performance. 2.4 gigahertz is basically dead, although it's kind of where Wi-Fi, really made mass market adoption. 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi does not travel as well as 2.4. Obviously, it gets very heavily attenuated by walls and other materials, so that makes it a much bigger challenge. And now Wi-Fi is talking about moving to 6 gigahertz. As they look to open and kind of provide additional spectrum, which is a huge requirement to offer higher and higher speeds, and that'll just make the problem even harder. I think one of the things that's really a challenge right now is a lot of the energy efficiency techniques that are used to, for example, on Windows and other things to ensure energy conservation actually really make havoc for things like Wi-Fi. Or any kind of EM signal, whether it's sunlight or a wireless signal. Things like whiteboards are also dangerous, very bad for your Wi-Fi network. So I think that just makes it a huge challenge in terms of what you're dealing with day in, day out. And the network can change dynamically on the fly, just in general, depending on what's going on in the airspace around you. So that makes operating Wi-Fi networks fairly challenging. We have tools to try and identify those things when they happen. I'd say most events, when they happen, they're not long lasting. They pretty much persist for a small period of time, then they abate. But things that are longer lasting, we do go out and investigate and try and resolve them. But that's a big part of why Wi-Fi becomes slower at times. And you're also sharing it with those around you. So depending on the behavior of a single client, they can change the experience for the other people using that same access point. If they're doing a lot of broadcast type traffic or other kinds of things, it can create other kinds of problems for the other users. I won't jump too far. Just to pick up on the last question, do you monitor for rogue access points? Yes, we do. We do look for those things. Generally speaking, they don't cause too much disruption. Something discussed in 24 was IoT devices. How has that changed since then? And have there been any interesting attacks on that surface? So IoT devices, I think, continue to be a challenge. Our facilities department probably has an IoT network that's bigger than the MIT campus network at this point in terms of number of devices that are actually connected. That's how big their control network is in terms of internet-enabled devices. I think on the technology side, one of the biggest challenges there is they still running an MS-DOS TCP/IP stack in a lot of cases, which is, it's very nostalgic, but it's not very effective from a security standpoint. And that makes it a huge challenge. I'd say the other one's cultural. And I think sometimes, we talk about a lot of things in the technical domain. I think the cultural domain is actually one of the bigger challenges in security area. A lot of these folks now that are running, internet-enabled devices are, formerly electricians or plumbers or, heating and ventilation repair folks. They're not IT folks. And so they've IT enabled the world that they're supporting and operating, but the same folks culturally are not well versed in the types of skills and kinds of risks that go with operating those kinds of things. So I'd say from an industry standpoint, IoT, one of the biggest challenges we see is there's a required cultural kind of evolution that needs to take place for the people operating those systems. And that's something we're working with them to kind of, help them through that journey. But that's something that whole industry is going through at this time, and that, things will get better over time, but the growth is going to be painful. We did a lot of work with facilities across campus since we gave that lecture in 2014, with really helping them segment and rethink their entire network setup for how they do operate their IoT devices. So I'd say that was a result of a partnership we've had over the last 3 years. And so over the last 3 years, we've migrated them to using 2FA for everything, using segmented networks that are not part of the campus network. We've done a lot of good work with them, with Jessica and Marco's teams. Marco's our infrastructure guy, to kind of try and better secure their IoT devices. Anything you want to add to that, Jessica?
Yeah, just one of the other things that we often see with those types of devices and that culture that Mark was talking about is that they might buy a device and not, in addition to not thinking about the risks of the device now, they don't think about like the care and feeding that that's going to require over the lifetime, so it might never get patched, it might never get replaced. Often it's ambiguous, like whose responsibility it even is. They might think it's theirs or facilities IT or the vendors. So that's another thing that, it comes up in different flavors all over campus. We call it technical debt, but it's another common thing that we see. And not related to facilities, but we do see IoT things pop up on the MIT network all the time. Everybody likes their Raspberry Pis, and nobody likes to change the default password. So we see those quite frequently getting compromised and start scanning around.
So I think we're an hour in, and so I appreciate actually the time you guys are making available for 858, even though there's clearly a lot of fires happening with this current set of changes. Any last questions? Anybody? Well, there are no further questions, then I'd like to thank you both, Jessica, Mark, Ryan, and all of the others who were online and helping with answering the questions. Very much appreciated, and I guess stay healthy and keep the MIT network up so we can keep doing classes.
We'll do everything we can. We love doing this, so thanks for having us, even with everything going on, and hope everyone's staying safe and has a good end of term.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.